Hello, and a very warm welcome to this edition of the Ponsonby and Massie podcast. This is part two of our musings on the publication of Nicola Sturgeon's memoir, Frankly. In part one, the only thing we had to go on were the extracts which were published in the Times and the Sunday Times. We have now had the chance to read the book, to consider the book, and to offer a more rounded and a more definitive judgment on it. So before we get into some of the specific issues, like the relationship with Mr. Salmond, like how she dealt with the trans issues, like some of the observations that she makes in a whole series of issues, I suppose the first question that we have to ask is a very, very simple one. Has this memoir done her more good than harm, Alex?
Well, and it has done her bank balance and a significantly amount of good. I think the advance for it was 250 or 300,000 pounds. So, to that extent, Nicola Sturgeon is much better off for having written her memoir than would have been the case if she had not done so. Whether readers are better off is a rather different matter, of course. I am not convinced that they are. I mean, I think one of the difficulties that this book has, and its reception, I think, demonstrates this, is that people's ideas on and about Nicola Sturgeon are pretty fixed. She's been a public figure in Scotland for a long, long time. She is somebody about whom very few people in Scotland are indifferent. And so those people who admire her, I think, will find in this book plenty of things to justify their admiration. The larger, more vociferous reaction, of course, has been, I think, from people who do not perhaps admire Nicola Sturgeon. And again, there is plenty of material in the book, I think, that will substantiate their views, their prejudices, if you like. I think if you like Nicola Sturgeon, you'll find in this, plenty of material to say, yeah, this is why she was a great First Minister, the most significant First Minister we've had, first woman First Minister, longest serving First Minister, etc., etc., etc. If, on the other hand, you have a lower opinion of Nicola Sturgeon, then again, there is ample material here to justify that.
Yeah, I just pick up one of the points you made, which is how polarizing a figure that she is. I said in the first edition of the podcast that probably after about 5 or 7 years, most politicians probably not only run out of steam in terms of what they're doing in government, but even if they start off vaguely quite popular, and if you look at where Nicola Sturgeon started off in 2015 and where she ended up at the time of departure, it was a complete world of difference. After about 5 or 7 years, I think the public fall out of love with whoever is actually governing them. But there's a wider point to that because some politicians are then elevated into special status of detestation or hagiography, depending on where you come. I've always said in my journalistic career, there were two politicians that you couldn't have a sensible conversation about or a logical conversation. One was Margaret Thatcher and one was Tony Blair. And even to this day, if you mention Margaret Thatcher in some people's company, they go completely puce in the face and are about to go with a volcanic eruption. And I thought, well, nobody will be more hated in modern political times than Margaret Thatcher. But how wrong was I? Because in a sense, Tony Blair was even more hated because Blair was hated by the political right because he was electorally successful. And he was hated by sections of the left because he was regarded as somebody who kicked politics in general terms by, in their view, him telling a whole series of lies about a basis upon which to go to war. So you could never have a rational discussion about either Thatcher or Blair. And again, I think that Nicola Sturgeon has to join that pretty lofty club because it is not possible, I think, to have a logical discussion among a large group of people because views on are all polarized. Yes, I agree. It's done very well for her bank balance. She'll have to declare how much she got for the Julie Etchingham interview, but given she got 25 grand for appearing as a panelist in the overnight in the ITV election program, I would have thought that it would have been a minimum of that. It was a network half hour, and probably the budget for a network half hour is way in excess of 50 grand. And she was the sort of sole star of the show, so to speak. So, yes, very, very much financially rewarding. But overall, I think that this book will have done her damage. She felt clearly the need to write it, and the most interesting stuff from my point of view is all the personal stuff. I don't think that we learned a great deal politically, but as the SNP's opponents have been saying, you might have thought that there would have been an explanation for everything that went wrong on her watch. And there is simply nothing there. And I think that the historians of tomorrow, when it comes to writing this up, will simply make the point. There is very little in this book which is instructive. And I think the judgment will be made about her time in office. And the judgment will be that from an independence perspective, she didn't move the dial, and there she deeply frustrated large bits of the independence movement. And in policy terms, in terms of the ambitions that she set for her own government, she failed on those
Mhm.
ambitions, and that the exit from office, particularly around the way in which she handled the de facto referendum and the trans issues, were politically badly handled, and that goes to the heart of her judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, in one sense, frankly, is the right title for it because she does do quite a bit of saying, well, I got this wrong or I was unhappy with that and so on. We could have done this better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But cumulatively, over the course of the book and so on, it ended up striking me as being a very Presbyterian kind of candor. That is to say, that she wants to be admired for being so candid, for admitting mistakes, but when you look at these mistakes more closely, whether it's on education, whether it's on matters of political strategy with regard to independence or any number of other issues and so on, when you look at her mistakes forensically and so on, it turns out they weren't mistakes at all. And actually, she wants to be admired for saying I got things wrong, while at the same time saying, actually, if you look at it properly, I didn't get it wrong. And as I say, it's a proper sort of old-fashioned Scots Presbyterian cakeism, if you like, wanting to be saluted for your candor and honesty, while at the same time sliding away from real candor, real honesty, real accountability for your mistakes. And I think that becomes, over the course of the book, one of the sort of dominant motifs. So, for instance, just take one small example of it. She says that Scotland's drug deaths record, which, remember, the number of drug deaths essentially doubled in her time as office. She says that this is one of her deepest regrets. And you think, well, okay, that is interesting. But if that is true, if it really is one of your deepest regrets, Miss Sturgeon, wouldn't you devote more than 3 paragraphs in your book to it? Wouldn't you? She devotes more time to her appearance on Jon Stewart's comedy show, The Daily Show in New York, than she does to drug deaths, which is supposedly one of her deepest regrets. She doesn't mention a whole load of other things. On education, for instance, she says that her record has been traduced by her opponents. Ah, but she's, she then sort of says, well, in the end, what is the point of any education reforms? Because the only thing that really counts is poverty. If unless we can we can eliminate poverty, we can't expect to make progress on the poverty-related attainment gap. And you think, well, okay, but that's not what you said. You said that you were going to eliminate that attainment gap, and you haven't done it. So and you asked that you wanted to be judged on this. And so it is not unreasonable, I think, for people to take you at your word and judge you on it. But she sort of slides away from accountability there. There are other things that just go completely unmentioned. So, for instance, the ferries. Now I know there are lots of SNP people who are bored of hearing about ferries, but the only reason people talk about it is that they spent £400 million on 2 ferries that don't float. It's not unreasonable to bring that up. But so that's another sort of thing where there's just no mention of it whatsoever. It's like it didn't happen. We'll pretend it didn't happen, and therefore we don't have to be accountable for it. And there's rather too much of that, I think, in this book.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right on the ferries point. If you're an islander, this has been the most
Hmm.
important issue of the devolved era. The ferries
Yeah.
issue is the most important issue of the devolved era. And in a sense, I regard the ferries issue as the biggest scandal of public procurement, bigger than the Holyrood building project, in the sense that we sort of vaguely knew why the Holyrood building project overran the way that it did. It was because when the client changed from being the Scottish office to the Scottish Parliament corporate body, the corporate body ripped everything up, started again, increased the floor space of the Parliament. And once they did that, you were on a runaway financial train where the destination was a long way off. We sort of knew at the point when they did this, this was going to get completely and utterly out of control. But this is a spectacular failure of ministerial oversight for the procurement and spending of public money, which has cost the taxpayers probably around or perhaps even more than £300 million. This is not a trivial matter. This is genuinely um, a national disgrace. And for those who rely on ferries, it's the number one issue of the entire devolved era. But as you say, nothing, no sense of contrition. And of course, the sort of the elephant in the room of the and even in the sort of final pages, or towards the end of the book, she talks about Alex Salmond in a sense, still casting a shadow over her as a person and her politics. And on this, she, I think, was in the kind of territory where she was damned if she did, and if she was damned if she didn't. Supporters of Mr. Salmond have basically been saying this book dances on his grave. Alec Neil has gone on the record as saying she owes Moira Salmond a public apology for some of the stuff which is in the book and the observations. And although there are not terribly many new lines in terms of the disintegration of the relationship over the way in which misconduct allegations were made against Sam. And there's earlier stuff which is now cast up in the book in order to have a longer narrative which questioned his judgment. To a certain extent, she could have said, this will be construed as being in bad taste. I better not go there, or I better be very careful what I'm saying. On the other hand, if she was pulling her punches too much or decided not to talk about it at all, they would have said this memoir isn't credible because it doesn't deal with her mentor turned nemesis. So she was damned if she did, and she was damned if she didn't. And I don't think it was credible for her to write this memoir without at least covering these events in relation to the disintegration of the relationship with Alex Salmond. But of course, and one of the key things, well, she said it would have been so Alec to have leaked the story
Mm.
about the sort of misconduct allegations to the Daily Record as a means of controlling the narrative, because this would have been very Alex. Well, we now have a situation where very unusually, actually, very unusually, the journalist who wrote the story, David Clegg, who was then working with the Daily Record and is now the editor of the Courier, felt the need to say, and if I was a journalist, I wouldn't even entertain a discussion. I wouldn't even entertain a discussion about a source. I would never confirm or deny that anybody was a source. But David Clegg, who is a very, very good
A straight
journalist,
shooter.
a very, very, very good journalist, and a very, very decent bloke with sound editorial judgment, felt the need to come out and say it wasn't Salmond.
Yeah, I mean, and Sturgeon does this thing that, I'm just speculating here. I'm not saying it was Salmon who leaked the news that he was under investigation on allegations of sexual misconduct and so on to the Daily Record. I'm not saying it was him, but it would have been very much in character for him, And again, so that's you're making the accusation, but you're also sidling away from it and so on, giving yourself a little bit of wriggle room, a little bit of plausible deniability and so on. But actually the accusation is preposterous and so on. She says that Salmon would it would have been very much in character for Alec to have done this because that allowed him to present himself as the victim. And you think, well, hang on a minute. The front page of the Daily Record was saying that Alex Salmond is being investigated for on allegations of sexual misconduct. That's not Mr. Salmond becoming the victim there, you know. So there's an awful lot of after the fact refereeing of things. So you have again on something like and it's always Nicola always looks better than Alec does at every stage in the thing. So, she wrote the white paper on independence, she says, and he wasn't interested in it. He didn't read it. He couldn't be bothered engaging with it. To read this book, you would get the impression that she ran the campaign for independence, and that Salmond was actually a sort of walk-on player in his own narrative, which is not how I recall it. But, time and time again, you have this sort of thing where, Nicola is doing the right thing and Alex has to be talked into it. So, for instance, there is stuff about how, he was, as she says, implacably opposed at one point to legislating for gay marriage to be legalized. And you think, well, okay, maybe. Well, why? It was the political impact of this. Hammond, is said to have said, well, a little concerned about whether this will make us less popular and so on, and make it harder to win an independence referendum, etc., etc., etc. And she says, no, 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 we've got to do this. This is the right thing to do. And you think, again, okay, fine. But in her narrative and so on, there is no mention of the extremely salient detail, for instance, that the passage of equal marriage legislation in Scotland was made vastly easier, smoother, less controversial by the fact that it had already been passed in England, that David Cameron's Conservative Party had already legislated for gay marriage in England, which then made it very easy, much easier, I think, actually, for equivalent legislation to be passed in Scotland. So she wants all the glory for, passing this landmark piece of legislation, but without giving anything like the real context for it. And again, this is this sort of thing of wanting to making up her own rules, if you like. And declaring herself the victor and the better person, and this is a sort of thread that runs throughout this
Yeah,
memoir.
two issues that I'll pick up on in the book where, again, she's sort of saying Salmond was on this page and I was on that page, and we'll pick up that one on the repeal of Section 2A, as I think it was sort of technically called. Of course,
But better known as Section
better known
28,
as
yeah,
Section
which was the
28.
sort of
One of the
yeah.
one of the problems that I think you have is that, I mean, Alex Salmond is not around to rebut these, so you can only sort of look at what she said, take it at face value, and for someone like myself who knows both of them, I sort of, and it's only my view. Alex Salmond may well have another view of this. I'm sure he if he was here, then he would on the Section 28 stuff. I mean, the STV broke the story about the repeal of Section 2A because I remember I did the interview with Wendy Alexander where it was announced. And it then became a central feature of the parliamentary by election in Ayr in 2000. And the Labour Party were having an awful time of it because they couldn't square Cardinal winning. And her allegation essentially is that Alex on these issues was socially conservative, and that he could see the way in which Labour were under a lot of pressure on this from certain elements of their base. And really, what the charge is was that he played politics with the issue for the SNP's electoral advantage. Now, I remember the period very, very well, and I remember the Ayr by election, and I remember the tortured position that Jim Mather, who was the SNP's candidate, was taking on all of this. And I couldn't for the life of me work out why the SNP simply didn't stand full square behind Labour on what was just a straightforward issue of repealing a piece of legislation which had never been used and wasn't needed. And of course, if you like, the playing of politics was it, that charge which she makes to me sounded credible. It sounded credible in relation to where Alex's position would have been on that. But of course, we'll never know what he would have said about this. The second issue, which I am again, I hear what she says on it, is in relation to the white paper, which of course is the you know during the referendum, the white paper is the Bible at that point. Now I remember covering that launch in the Science Centre. The reason I remember it is I had a series of stand up fights with press officers about the length of time that it was taking to get my interview because it was needed for the lunchtime news. And because this was an international story, in essence, all 57 branches of the BBC were doing their own interviews, which meant that there were 57 BBC interviews before I
Are
arrived.
you suggesting that the BBC could cut some things without losing too much,
So,
Bernard? Gosh,
so
you veteran of commercial
I
television, you.
I was going nuts at this point, and I anyway they managed to assuage me, and I got my interview and all the rest of it. But Salmon's performance at that launch of the white paper was a tour de force. I mean, I'd watched him on times where he was very, very sharp. On other occasions when he was just bullish. On other occasions where his mood was different, where he appeared to want to pick a fight with individual journalists. But that particular launch, he was absolutely on his game. And that performance was not consistent with a man who wouldn't read the white paper or sign off the white paper or go over the details of the white paper. He appeared to be across the details of everything. Of course, on the particular day when she said to him, have you read this and are you going to do this? He may well have just sort of swatted it away, which again, if Alec wasn't in the mood, that was a very Alec thing to do, was simply to swat it away. But the idea that he wasn't steeped in the content of the white paper, no, not buying that at all.
Well, she says that he was basically winging it, which it ends up being essentially her verdict on his entire time as first minister. A lot of the time, there is a sort of contrast between that she offers time and time and time again about how Nicola is the sort of conscientious, detail-oriented first minister, to be contrasted with Alex Salmond and so on, who was neither of those things, and that is a sort of motif that runs through the entire book. There's a little bit in this limited respect, I would suggest. There are sort of shades of Blair and Brown here. The relationship between them is different because, Nicola Sturgeon was never the senior figure, then overtaken by the younger, flashier model in the way that Gordon Brown was overtaken by Tony Blair. But nevertheless, there is a sense in which, she and Brown again both make great play about how hard they worked, and we are implicitly asked, I think, to contrast this with the great other in the room in this, whether it's Tony Blair or Alex Salmond, and I think that is a long running motif throughout the entire book, actually. And again, there are things where I think fair-minded readers will sympathise with her, and so on. When there is one page where she is treated appallingly, by her own account anyway, by a male MSP in her early years in the Parliament. She makes the point time and time again that women are judged differently and held to different standards than male politicians are, and you think, well, yes, that is probably broadly true. On the other hand, at the 30th time this is mentioned, you wonder, well, is this the case, or are you using your sex a little bit as a kind of shield, to defend yourself against perfectly reasonable criticism? And this is one of the problems I think that you have in the book and so on, is that actually, when you dial down into it, Nicola Sturgeon doesn't think there is perfectly reasonable criticism of her choices, of her policies, of her decisions, and all the rest of it, and so on. She says, "I am sorry for getting things wrong, but in the end, actually, what she really means is, I am sorry other people were too stupid to agree with me."
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of the abuse that women get, and including Nicola Sturgeon, because we do this podcast, I am not a great fan of social media, but I feel the need to go through it because you have to know what's been said out there if you're going to comment on it. And so I have gone through newspaper articles, I've read readers' comments, I've gone on to X and I've read the stuff.
Mm.
And to this day, the vile misogyny in relation to
Mhm.
Nicola Sturgeon is still there. Any man who argues that she's not the victim of misogyny cannot read, or if they,
Yeah. No, I'd agree
and
with
if they
that. Yeah.
cannot read, they cannot understand. And again, when I've gone through some of this stuff, it's been. I mean, I'll read it for 3 or 4 minutes, and I have to put it down because it's a complete and utter sewer. And I'm afraid that's where we are with public discourse. Last night, I read J.K. Rowling's review of the book. It's just as well I was lying down in bed at the time because
It's quite punchy, isn't it?
because I could feel the blows. Because I could feel the blows. I mean, this was bare knuckle stuff. But that's fine. The dissection of a politician and the attacks of a politician on political grounds and for what they have said in public is absolutely fair game. And I think in that context, Brian Wilson's column in the Herald the other day was very much in a similar vein. But there were 1 or 2 points in the book that, notwithstanding that she is the victim of vile misogyny, people should just admit to that,
Mhm.
and nor should they use the fact that they do not like her politics as some sort of defense or cover for behavior which is completely unacceptable. But that being said, there were 1 or 2 issues in the book where I thought, frankly, do I need to know this? Frankly, do I need to know this? Now, the thing that you referenced about the bullying from the MSP, who isn't named incidentally, I thought, well, if you're going to be frank about it and you're going to raise it, who is it? Who is it?
Mhm.
Name and shame. After all, the title of the book is Frankly. It was in relation to um, a fictitious story, if you recall, where there was lots of jokes and jibes going around that she had left teeth marks on a sexual partner's penis, which earned her the nick,
I'm very glad you're explaining this,
wh- which
Bernard,
uh,
not me.
which earned her the nickname Nasha. And that every time she encountered this MSP, there would be jokes about teeth and oral sex and all the rest of it. Now, as she makes clear in the book, this is a completely made up story which got to the extent of urban myth. But I thought, I don't need to know this. I really don't need to know this. And again, even I think the dealing, how she dealt with her sexuality, and this view that sexuality is sort of non-binary. It was almost a sort of formulaic way of addressing the issue. If Nicola's view is that I'm attracted to men and I'm attracted to women, just say it. Nobody's bothered.
Mhm.
I did see, again, flicking through social media, one lesbian had tweeted, so her view appears to be that for all of us, sexual preference is non binary. As a lesbian of 40 years, it would appear that Nicola's view is that I just haven't met the right bloke. So even again, I think there are instances where there's some stuff I thought you just don't need. I don't need to know this. And even when she's trying to be frank, she holds back because she doesn't name the MSP.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a couple of issues there, but I think that it's worth getting back into. The gender ideology stuff, the gender recognition reforms that Scottish Parliament passed. SNP votes, but Green votes, Labour votes, Lib Dem votes, 3 Conservatives as well. Again, there's a very, very partial reading of this, and to some extent, this is what you expect from a political memoir. Politicians are there to justify themselves, but if you are going to call your memoir frankly, then you ought to, I think, address the stronger arguments against yourself and so on. There's a lot of straw manning going on in her book. You have the situation where obviously, the Scottish Parliament passes this bill. And then, 3 weeks later, they have the embarrassment of the Adam Graham stroke Isla Bryson affair. The double rapist who says I'm a woman and is initially incarcerated in the female prison estate, and Nicola Sturgeon says I can't understand why I wasn't informed about this. Well, you wasn't informed about it because this was standard operating practice for the Scottish Prison Service, that we're operating on the basis of de facto self ID, which was what the Scottish Parliament had just passed a bill to legislate for. So the prison service was operating along the lines that Nicola Sturgeon wanted everyone to operate on. And she then has this interview, I think with Peter Smith of ITV and so on, who did her up like a proper kipper on this. Where it said, well, what's is Isla Bryson a man or a woman? And she says, she stumbled through it. And so my view is that individual is a rapist, leading to the novel situation where in Scotland we had three sexes, male, female, and rapist. And she now says, I wished I had the courage of my convictions properly and answered that properly. And so on, which would have been to say, yes, Isla Bryson is a woman. And then in subsequent interviews for the book and so on, with the one with Julie Etchingham on ITV that you referenced earlier, Bernard, she says, well, yes, of course, Isla Bryson is a biological male, but also, in her view, a woman. And she doesn't address the fairly obvious contradictions in this. And there is this sense where she blames her opponents for making this a toxic issue. J.K. Rowling, J.K. Rowling wears a T-shirt, and that becomes saying Nicola Sturgeon, destroyer of women's rights. That becomes the moment at which rational debate becomes impossible in this whole area of policy. And you think, well, hang on a minute. Is that really when it became impossible? Or was it when the First Minister of Scotland said that her opponent's views were simply, quote, not valid, unquote? Or when she suggested that, without again naming names and so on, that just as you would find people who were opposed to her gender recognition reforms were, quote, transphobic, unquote, you would also find that they were, in many instances, homophobic and racist and misogynist and bigoted in every way under the sun, and so on, again, without naming names and so on. So a general sort of slur on her opponents. And, you think, well, all of that happened well before the legislation actually came before Parliament. And you think, well, again, you have this thing where Nicola Sturgeon is one of these people who is forever deploring culture wars, which are always started by other people, always fought by other people. She is merely an innocent bystander, inadvertently dragged into the culture war arena, a place that she wouldn't want to be at all. And it just keeps happening to her. She's terribly unlucky on that front. And you think, well, again, yes, we know that political memoirs are about self-justification and so on. But there is an astonishing amount of special pleading in this one.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I mean, I think that the historians will judge that she was a bad manager of political affairs. A lot of modern politics is about how you manage the issue, and we have witnessed, have we not, in the context of Westminster, for over a year now, model lessons on how not to manage political issues. I mean, everything Keir Starmer touches. He's got the reverse of the Midas touch. It just seems to turn to shit, and really rather quickly. I think the two things towards the end of her time, her management of the independence strategy, the de facto referendum, and the handling of gender recognition, reveal a politician without an appropriate political touch. And I think that the historical judgment on both of these issues will be pretty damning. And of course, there are already enough damning verdicts on these two issues from people from within her own party. And, the point in the book where she says, I should have perhaps been more alert to how divisive the gender recognition issue was going to be. And when I was reading it, I was thinking, weren't you actually watching any news program at night? Weren't you aware of the demonstrations which were taking place at the front door of the Parliament? Weren't you hearing the anguish from participants on both sides of this debate? So the idea that the issue of gender recognition sort of crept up as a divisive issue would appear to me to be a complete and utter misreading of the situation. But having said that in the book, in the Etchingham interview, she goes even further. She actually, I think the shot in the ITV program on Monday night, she sort of holds up her hands and says, I really should have just called a halt to it to see whether or not we should have had a middle ground. And herein lies the problem with this entire issue. There is no middle ground. You can have legislation which allows an individual, a biological male, to self identify as a woman. What you cannot do is that you cannot alter the reality of biological sex. And there is no way in which you can square these two positions. And the matter of common sense, which is where the Supreme Court have landed with all of this, ought to have been obvious. But in trying to square the irreconcilable, you then get politicians like Nicola Sturgeon, and Keir Starmer as well, and
Hmm.
indeed
Hmm.
lots of other people in the Scottish Parliament as well who signed up for a lot of this, to try and face two ways at once. And I'm afraid that when something, as a matter of logic, is impenetrable because it is rooted in fact, she should have seen what the obvious consequences were of trying to face two ways at once on this issue. And that, I think, speaks to a lack of political judgment.
Yeah, and I think it's consistent also with lots of things. So I mean, in certain respects, Nicola Sturgeon is a remarkable politician. If you are broadly sympathetic, or more pertinently, if she is broadly sympathetic to where you are, to your interests, to what it is you want from politics, so then she is capable of extraordinary emotional intelligence, which she says is the greatest quality that any politician can have. So she has her comfort zone, and it is very much public sector and third sector is very much her comfort zone. The private sector, corporate Scotland, is unknown to her. Um, uh, but this sort of, if you like, binary, either her emotional intelligence is on or it's off, extends throughout the book and throughout her political career, actually. And so if you consider the national question, the constitutional question, you have this again. So, she has no understanding, frankly, of why anyone voted no in the independence referendum in 2014. She takes the view that, well, if there were no voters, and obviously there were lots of them, then they are yes voters delayed, effectively. And she just doesn't understand Scottish history. I would suggest, actually, there's an intriguing line in the book where she says, Scotland is a small country governed by its larger neighbour. That's a category error as far as the vast majority of no voters are concerned. They don't see it like that. They do not think Scotland is governed by England. They take the view that Scotland is part of the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom governs itself. Which is, it's not actually a small distinction. That it's something that speaks to the heart of Nicola Sturgeon's worldview. And it's why she doesn't understand the 55% of Scottish voters who voted no in 2014, and why she fundamentally made almost no effort whatsoever at any point in her time as First Minister to talk to those voters. And that, it seems to me, is one of the great failings of her time in office. A time that began with an enormous amount of goodwill, including from no voters, who were very pleased that Alex Salmond was no longer in Butte House and so on, and were hoping for a fresh start with Nicola Sturgeon. So she had a lot of goodwill from people who wouldn't necessarily have voted for the SNP and certainly didn't vote yes in the referendum, but nevertheless they were open to giving her a fair chance, at least initially. Now I accept that wore off pretty quickly, but one of the reasons it wore off pretty quickly was that she never seemed to care or be interested in trying to understand why they thought the things they did. Again, their views were simply not valid.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in that, and particularly in relation to the tribal analysis which you take on the constitutional question. That if you're going to take a country from one constitutional starting point to another, in order to persuade in order to persuade those who are not with you, you first of all have to understand where they come from. And in a sense, I mean, I think both Salmond and Sturgeon were on the same page in this regard. And I'm uh, just in recent days with the death of George Reid, who was a very, very particular kind of nationalist. George Reid's starting point on all of this is that, well, what do we have that unites us? What do we have that unites us? And let's take that as the starting point. And if people are not on the page that you are on, you can only do it by reasoned argument. You can only do it not by telling them that they're wrong or that they haven't seen the light, by continually working to explain and to bring them along. I mean, George Reid, I think, almost uniquely was a non tribal politician. And when he left Holyrood, he neither had the inclination or the temperament to go back into the bear pit of party politics, although he believed to his dying day that independence was the correct way forward. I just wonder because I think on his day, George Reid was as good as any politician of the devolved era. And I was thinking in recent days, if George Reid's style and George Reid's tone and George Reid's view of getting as many people into the tent for the big picture and doing it by taking people along on the basis of consensus and not on the basis of rubbishing their point of view, had been tone and style and substance. And he was the leader of the campaign in 2014. The no side of the campaign might have got a closer run for
Mhm.
their money, but there you are. I mean, just one final point, because I think we've been
Mhm.
going for about 40 minutes now on Nicola Sturgeon. What will
Mhm.
she do in the future? I think because she's been candid about, if you like, personal demons on this book. These are the kind of issues which she's brought to the fore, where prospective employers or people who are perhaps looking for a figurehead to spearhead an organization may well think her time has come and gone in terms of a frontline leadership position. She's also hinted that it may well be worthwhile living somewhere else, perhaps in the short term, realizing and understanding how Marmite a figure that she is. And, you know, if you cannot get any sense of a private life, which everybody is entitled to, absolutely everybody is
Mhm.
entitled to.
Yeah,
If
agreed.
you cannot have a private life because you go out to the cinema or to the theatre or to a restaurant and there's some lunatic that wants to harangue you after you have departed the political stage, that ain't pleasant. And she may well feel the need to put some space between herself and the country, live somewhere else. And, you know, look, at the end of the day, we're all human. I don't subscribe to the view that even though I can take the view that people have not been good for the country or the record has not been good, and I don't think that she has a political record to be proud of. Nevertheless, I do not believe that she entered politics for the purposes of becoming unpopular. And as I would say to any politician who has borne the burdens of office, particularly during the COVID period, they
Mhm.
are on a personal sense. It is difficult. In fact, no one can understand the pressures unless you've actually been in them. And I think that on the basis of sort of basic humanity, you can actually say somebody has to take these decisions, and you may well not agree with them, but you don't always have to deduce them. Attack the record, attack the politics, and yes, even say that you don't like the personality. But to bring things like her gender into it and the rampant misogyny, there shouldn't be a place for it. And these books are full of her demons. I hope in the future she finds some sort of peace.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, what you're saying there is the old Teddy Roosevelt line about the man, or in this case, the woman in the arena. And unless you have been the man or the woman in the arena and so on, then, nobody, not even those of us who are paid to follow these things very closely and so on, have a true understanding of what it is to actually be the person making the decisions that have real impacts and real consequences for people that you will never meet. And that is a heavy burden, and it's one obviously shared by all political leaders. And I think, to give her some credit, and so on, Nicola Sturgeon has an awareness of that, and that that line from Othello, "I have done the state some service, and they know it," ends up being the epitaph for most political careers. And I suspect that that is also a fair one for her. The tragedy of Nicola Sturgeon is, of course, I suppose, that she started out with such high expectations and with such a wide-ranging, groundswell of support. And then that diminished over time. And you then begin to wonder after a while, well, all that time, all that work, but to what great purpose? And that is, again, I suppose, a sort of pitiless verdict that you can render on an awful lot of political leaders. And it is, in that sense, Nicola Sturgeon's fate to be not unlike many other political leaders, many of whom she would deprecate and deplore herself.
Yeah, and as she may well say, or may well feel, for her it's a case of goodbye, farewell, and amen. But for this edition of the podcast from me, it's goodbye.
And it's goodbye from me.